Robert, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you for the invitation.
Can you tell us why you wanted to take a deep dive into the role the big 5 banks in Canada are planning when it comes to Indigenous relations?
Well, I think we've seen a lot of upheaval and a lot of issues around resource extraction, development projects, things like that across the country. And we have to remember that at the back end of all of these projects, there is money and financing supporting their ongoing land disturbances and things like that, and the impacts on Indigenous communities. So I wanted to parallel that with what the work that the banks are doing to build relationships with Indigenous communities, and whether or not it's meeting what they're investing or whether or not there's a disparity. And I think the report speaks for itself.
Now, your report is called Redwashing Extraction. Can you tell us about that title and why that title?
Yeah, so we've seen in my work with the Yellowhead Institute, we've seen a lot of conversations around this notion of greenwashing, which is how resource companies, industrial bodies, banks, governments do a lot of investing into climate initiatives, green energy, all of these other kind of fringe pushing initiatives, yet they're conflicting with what they're really doing in the back rooms and with other dealings and things like that. And what we wanted to highlight is that the same kind of issue is happening with Indigenous communities, that we're seeing a lot of piecemeal investments, we're seeing a lot of partnerships that are very superficial in nature. They're bringing on advisory bodies and things like that with Indigenous representation, but on the ground we're not seeing much of a difference, and really the investment lacks when regarding Indigenous relations and building meaningful relationships with Indigenous communities.
So, Robert, how are banks interpreting Indigenous rights in the era of reconciliation?
Well, as I go through in the report, they're very reliant on international measures and other kind of mechanisms, for instance, the Equator Principles, but the Equator Principles fall short in a sense that they point to a firm definition of free, prior, informed consent not existing, when in fact we know that Indigenous communities have been clear on what free, prior, informed consent means, yet the banks and other companies rely on that superficial, that watered down definition to kind of support their ongoing infractions on Indigenous rights, which we know are happening. And you just have to look at the news headlines and watch the national news and things like that to see where these conflicts are taking place and realize that there's a real problem happening.
So what role do you think divestment movements have had on the banks? And in recent years, that has been a lot of momentum on getting the banks to divest from certain industries or projects.
Well, I think we've seen a lot of some success in terms of divesting from coal, for instance, and other really, really harmful and impactful industries for green energy kind of specific focus. But in terms of Indigenous relations, Indigenous land violations, things like that, we're still seeing those kind of conflicts ongoing. So there may be divestment in other areas, but there seems to be an increased investment in other industries, and that not only does that continue to do harm, but it may even do more harm, as we're seeing with the ongoing Trans Mountain expansion and other projects like that, where we're seeing salmon run being interrupted and other things. Even though they've divested from other industries, they may be increasing their investment in other areas.
And lastly here, Robert, what do you hope people take away from this report?
Well, I think individual Canadians, individual Indigenous people really think about what role the banks play, how their money, their own investments in the banks, what role they're playing as well, and whether or not they can push their leadership to make some different choices, some advocacy positions. When you look at the banks and some of their various advocacy bodies and advisory bodies, there are chiefs and leaders sitting on those bodies, giving them some sort of legitimacy. I think it's time for grassroots people, for regular Indigenous people, to really question the role that those bodies play and whether or not they're doing more harm than good.
All right, certainly a lot to think about there, Robert. We do have to leave it there, so we'll have to let you go, but certainly appreciate all your insight on this.
No, thank you for the opportunity and happy to be here.